This nice lady, and we got into a conversation over a couple of drinks. And I said, hey, why don't you come chat with us? So this lady is named Rachel Sue. She is a local entrepreneur, as well as being an author. She graduated from Carroll University in Wisconsin with degrees in poli-sci and religious studies. So she kind of touts herself as being a bit of an anarchist. So I'm going to let her explain that piece. But would you please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Rachel Sue.
Fellowship with one another? Yeah, awesome. Okay, I'm about to speak on a very controversial subject here. I'm about to speak on the unconstitutionality of the COVID lockdowns and the mandates. So please bear with me and try not to hate me. Oh, you can't hear me? Yeah. Okay, now you can hear me? Hello, checking.
Just remember, you're preaching to the choir.
Yeah, no, it's been about 15 years since I've done a speech, and I've gotten some pretty heavy feedback on this, so, yeah. All right, so how many of you believe that the COVID-19 lockdowns and mandates are in fact unconstitutional? All right, that's quite a few of you. How many of you have actually done research and you know that the COVID-19 lockdowns are unconstitutional? All right, well, this speech is about to be very boring for you all, so I hope that you enjoyed your breakfast.
Not boring at all.
Wonderful. All right, so face masks, business closures, open space closures, indoor, outdoor space mandates, curfews, basically arbitrary mandates of any kind are completely unconstitutional on their face. And how do we know this? We know this because the actors involved with usurping the Constitution have actually left a historical breadcrumb trail for nerds like myself of constitutional law history and legislative acts. That is why today I am going to discuss how this happened through a conjuncted historic timeline of Supreme Court rulings that have brought us to where we are today, so that we can all be on the same page and see that government officials are very clearly working outside of the Constitution to do these mandates. They are working through emergency powers legislation, judicial activism, and executive mandates that cannot be described as anything other than a coup against the American people. I will then apply their process to the state of Colorado's lockdowns. And then lastly, I will discuss minutely about how this process has been used throughout the United States to amount to what has been a medical tyranny. So how many of you know what judicial activism is? Okay, that's actually more than the average American population. Judicial review, according to uscourts.gov, is actually the best known power of the Supreme Court. That is to interpret law from the bench and decide what the law is. But even according to uscourts.gov, this power of the Supreme Court is not actually in the text of the Constitution. So they have actually given themselves this power, and they did this in a ruling all the way back in 1803. That ruling is called Marbury v. Madison. When the courts unilaterally granted themselves this extra or outside of the constitutional power, they stated that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. That the Constitution is a finite legal document with many holes and gaps in it, and it is up to the courts to opine on exactly those legal situations. But this isn't anywhere in the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution actually expressly states what the courts have jurisdiction over, and they have jurisdiction over all cases arising under the Constitution. Because the Constitution is a contract, and so they do not have jurisdiction for any issues arising outside of the Constitution, only under it. So the courts have actually used this simultaneously to restrict individuals' rights and to rule against individuals having their rights violated. Okay, while also simultaneously allowing state and local governments to do unconstitutional shutdowns, mandates, etc., just as like a quasi-approval, yet it's kind of like a de facto absent precedent where they're at the same time saying, oh, I don't really have the authority to rule over this particular situation, and I can't really step in and tell the government that they're doing something wrong that's violating your rights. So instead of what was originally planned, which was to rely on the amendment process for the Constitution, the Supreme Court actually decided that they get to amend the Constitution in their opinions. And it just so happens that there is a singular judge who is consistently ruling over these types of cases here in Colorado. His name is U.S. District Judge David D. Domenico. Judge Domenico also consistently rules outside of the federal and state constitution in order to clear these mandates here in Colorado. He has stated he has used one singular person's testimony and the precedent from a court ruling, a Supreme Court ruling, called Jacobson v. Massachusetts. Jacobson v. Massachusetts was passed in 1905. This is an opinion by the Supreme Court who had an Amish man actually move from Pennsylvania to Massachusetts, and he had already gotten the smallpox vaccine in Pennsylvania. When he moved to Massachusetts, they were under a state of declared emergency, and the state of Massachusetts was demanding that everybody get a smallpox vaccine. But he fought it. He said, no, I already got one, I'm immune, and I don't need it. So he went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against him. They actually said, yeah, it's shocking. So he was actually fined daily for not getting the forced vaccination by the state of Massachusetts until he finally caved and got the vaccination. So that's how that story went down historically. But the Supreme Court ruled against him because they said that the general welfare power of the Constitution and the state's police powers actually allowed them to violate your rights during a declared emergency. As a matter of fact, they went so far as to say the entire Bill of Rights can be voided as long as a state declares that there is a medical emergency. So, they go on to state that as long as your individual rights are not impugned, and this is a direct quote, too much, okay? And as long as the restrictions from the state are reasonable, okay, during a medical emergency, that it's totally fine to violate an individual's rights. But who does get to decide what is a medical emergency? And who gets to decide what is reasonable or even too much? That is the case that we're experiencing today, where judges get to decide from the bench themselves. So, Judge D. Domenico has stated that he has used singular person's testimony, that is the head of the Colorado Department of Public Health, to say that it is an epidemic, or it would be an epidemic, because he got this information in March, just when the lockdowns happened. So there was no statistical evidence whatsoever that there was actually a pandemic at the time. He thinks that they're perfectly reasonable to him. He thinks that the lockdowns are perfectly reasonable to him, okay? And he even goes so far to state in a case, Lawrence v. Polis, that the legislature of Colorado actually delegated these powers to the health department and to Governor Polis, okay? But does the legislature actually have the power to delegate their duties, okay? The answer is unequivocally no. Article 3 of Colorado's state constitution is specifically and singular purpose is to actually clarify what the delegation of powers are between our three branches of government. It states verbatim, the powers of the government of this state are divided into three distinct departments, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And no person or collection of persons charged with the exercise of powers properly belonging to one of these departments shall exercise any power properly belonging to either of the others, except as in this Constitution expressly directed and permitted. But there is nothing in the Colorado State Constitution about emergency medical pandemic powers. There is nothing about emergency powers at all in the Constitution. There is no ratification of any such amendment that allows for delegation of legislative powers to the executive branch. These delegations were done through simple statute. This started in 1992 and have been amended multiple times since, all the way up through 2018. The delegation of powers from the legislature to the executive branch and its coinciding departments are unconstitutional all the time, including during an epidemic, and do not meet the legal standard required by our Constitution to be valid and enforceable, since they are simple statutes and not amendments to our Constitution. Governor Polis's office has actually acknowledged this in August 11th, 2020 memorandum, where he states, yes, most of my emergency powers come from statutes, and there is nothing in the Constitution that grants me these powers. Yet we sit here under illegal lockdowns still. So what happens when your legislature works outside of the Constitution to grant unilateral control to the executive, and it is reinforced through unconstitutional interpretation of the Constitution by the judicial branch? I really do hate to be the bearer of bad news. I love the Constitution. I love the United States of America, but we do have a specific group of people who have been usurping the Constitution. And this is done throughout all of the United States. There seems to be different protocols and procedures put into place with each state through various levels, all the way from they're talking about doing internment camps in New York to basically freedom in South Dakota. So it varies. So our Constitution has been suspended by real people in real time in what looks to be a soft war coup that has used a medical illness as an excuse to take control over the entire populace, as well as pass like multi-trillion-dollar bailouts that seem to be a money laundering scheme. So in some states, for example, Connecticut, the people actually ratified their own medical tyranny amendments, granting sole control to their governor during times of an emergency in their amendments. But there are places like Michigan where businesses and people have fought tooth and nail to say that these mandates are unconstitutional. And their Supreme Court has actually agreed with them, but they have not stopped the enforcement of these unconstitutional mandates. And their governors still refuse to lift them, which is very similar to what's happening here in Colorado. Judge Domenico actually ruled in October about how the mandates are unconstitutional for 2 churches. But instead of stopping the enforcement for everybody, he said just those 2 churches. So we continue to stay in lockdown basically because of this one singular judge ruling over these situations. So obviously, this is a very serious issue that needs to be addressed. We have legislatures working outside of the Constitution. We have judges working outside of the Constitution to essentially give sole control over our lives to one person, and that is the executive and their various departments. And I don't have all of the answers to this, but I have come to some very sound, logical conclusions. As an anarchist, I actually believe in voiding the Constitution, which is very controversial, but the reason why is because it is a contract, and that contract has allowed several people to work outside of it because of the holes and gaps. So I personally believe in voiding the Constitution, but I know a lot of people aren't ready for that yet. So I actually think that we should continue on the original path and the original intention of the Constitution, which was to continue amending the Constitution to fill those holes and gaps. So instead of letting SCOTUS continue to amend our Constitution, I believe that that needs to stop right now. That is not a power that we have granted to the Supreme Court, and they have used that to rule on health care, on segregation, and medical tyranny right now. Let's see. So SCOTUS opined in Marbury v. Madison about how the Constitution was a stopgap measure, and it was put into place to build faith amongst the several states. And when it was ratified, people acknowledged that it wasn't complete and it needed to continually be amended. Instead of doing the amendment process, the Supreme Court decided judicial review was the best route. It is very simple and it's easy and it doesn't require 2/3 of the country, but I certainly don't want 7 to 9 people deciding for all of us what our freedom is. And we have allowed SCOTUS to be the only amending party for most of our history, so that needs to stop and we need to rectify that. We have had many holes and gaps in the Constitution manipulated by a group of people for financial gain and control. There are several measures that we can actually take today that are discussed in my book, How Medical Tyranny Murdered the United States Constitution, which addresses all of this and more in further detail, including several topics that need to be managed through constitutional amendments. We cannot address this divided. As the American people, this is where we are at a crossroads for our country, and we really need to unite and determine how we can fix this issue, because it's not necessarily the foundational documents of this country, but it's people who have actually figured out how to usurp them and how to go around them. So if you're interested in purchasing a copy of How Medical Tyranny Murdered the United States Constitution, I'll be here after the speech. There's a few here. I had a little glitch with the printing, so if we need more copies, I'll be able to find a way to get them to you. They're $15 each. So thank you all sincerely for your time and for your service, and welcome home.
Questions, anybody? Sure.
I think all this socialism, communism starts right in the 8th grade.
Yeah, it really
It's too bad he left, because that's where somehow the socialist, communist teachers who have dominated the grade schools and middle schools and everything, especially the colleges, you know, has fought against us all the way. And they're the ones that are in power.
Oh, absolutely. I remember reading about Marbury v. Madison my sophomore year in high school in my history class, and they gave the impression that this is totally great, and they actually quote a different part of Marbury v. Madison where they state that the Supreme Court says that an unconstitutional law is just void on its face. But that's not what happens, and we continue to see that they've actually used that. So what they did in Marbury v. Madison, back in the day when they had Supreme Court opinions, they didn't just put a press release out. They actually had a journalist publish a book, and each one of those rulings had a preface to it. It was called a Ditka. And in the Ditka of Marbury v. Madison, this is where the Supreme Court discusses the holes and gaps in the Constitution and how they need to opine on those issues that are holes and gaps. So in the actual opinion, they say, oh, well, we don't really have the ability to rule over this situation, but it's not constitutional. And then pretty much the very next case that they choose a case that falls outside of the Constitution, and then they say, it's just gonna keep happening, and so we've gotta take these cases. And they basically built their entire historical precedent specifically choosing cases that fall outside of the Constitution so that they can continue giving the government extra constitutional powers. So we have to, just one second, we do have to keep in mind that the Constitution is a contract between you and I. It's not a contract between us and the government. The government and government officials are not a part, they are not a party of this contract, and they are not required to do anything legally or be legally bound to it. The only requirement for them is to actually, vow that they will not, they will follow the Constitution. That's all that they're required to do. And words, they don't really mean that much. Yes, sir.
So what we're seeing is, in our representative republic, is a push to do away with that specific representation and go to a democracy and allow the majority of the whole country as one to determine what our fate is. We are doing that as we give up the electoral college, which I do not understand why our state would even consider that.
Because they're liberal.
Well,
Yeah.
two things, Denver and Boulder.
Well, that, and as you see, we're outnumbered, right? So the other thing is that what irritates the crap out of me is to watch the legislators just have an issue that comes before them and refuse to pass or amend their laws that they passed, and rather have to get some kind of reconciliation, the parties involved go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court then, rather than kick it back to the legislature as they should, and force the people to do their damn jobs, they make a ruling that we all have to live with, for good or ill, most often for the other.
As somebody who's studied the entire history of the Supreme Court, I have to say I'm not very happy with them. It seems to be that the legislature and the executive and the judicial branch in a majority of the states and federally are actually working together to instill a medical tyranny. I mean, there's just no way to get around
But
it.
it goes beyond this,
It
event.
It goes
It's-
way
it's-
beyond it. They have been
Marriage
planning.
and identity and all this kind of.
Yeah, they've been planning this for what I feel is the entire time. I mean, if you've created a legal document that has legal holes in it that people can take advantage of, on its face, it's invalid and it's fraudulent.
And it's up to our representatives to fix it, not the Supreme Court to sit there and, they've used this term to, read the law and interpret it. Well, interpretation is up to somebody's opinion and their background and all that. No, it's not. It's up to the legislators to do their damn job.
Yes, legislatures absolutely need to do their jobs, and the executives need to stop trying to take their jobs away from them. So it seems like it's a working, cohesive relationship, considering Judge Domenico said, oh, well, the legislature delegated these powers to police, but they are actually not allowed to do that. They're constitutionally not allowed to do that. And you have a U.S. District Judge who says, even though I know that Article 3 in the Colorado Constitution exists, they still delegated it, and it just is what it is. And so that is where our issue is. It's not just the legislature or the Supreme Court, it's all of them working together. And they seem to have worked together to kind of chip away at the Constitution very slowly so that people really were taken off guard by what's happening here. And so, I wrote this book because I have two really small children. My daughter is 4 and my son is 2. And having to live in this situation where they can't go to the park, their favorite places are closed, they can't go to school, they're essentially prisoners. I heard in Canada that they're actually causing isolation for children who were exposed to COVID at school. So you've got 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, and 10-year-olds being forced and locked into their family's basement based off of government suggestions. So I personally can't stand here and say absolutely nothing about this because I've got to fight for my kids. And if I'm not gonna fight for my kids, I'm gonna fight for your kids, you know? So until the noose is around my neck, I will not be quiet about this. Yes, sir.
Well, isn't it up to, we say it's against our legislatures, but it's who we vote in.
It is.
I'm not talking about the R or the D. I'm talking about the people we put in there that, just like in Georgia when they said, oh, we were afraid they were gonna get hurt. Well, I went to war afraid that I was gonna get hurt, but did I go? Yes, I did.
Yes.
We need to know who we vote for.
Absolutely. I actually go into a little detail in my book about how they very probably stole the election. So,
Okay, Rachel will be here after the meeting. Please grab her. But Rachel, I want to thank you, and that'll look good on your desk. Now, I suppose that the alternate view must be presented in all fairness. So, just shut up and obey. Again, thank you, Rachel.
you're welcome.